But
yeah, I mean, that's worth doing.
yeah, and my new table. Here's the thing: I spent $800 on a car this week too, because I was just about to drive to the cabin, and I drove out of the driveway, and there was this fan belt sound, but it sounded a little bit scritchy, like bearings or something.
Right.
And so I drove straight to the mechanics, just to say, hey, I've got this new sound, before it goes too far. Yeah. Right as I turned into the parking lot, the power steering went out. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so it was basically that the pulley started to seize and just overheated the serpentine belt, the one that runs the alternator, the power steering, and the air conditioner. Unfortunately, there were little shavings. That was the scritchy bearings, but he was able to replace the pulley and replace the serpentine, blah, blah, blah. But I'm glad I didn't turn to go to the cabin and go, oh, I'll do this later. It's like, no, just do this now. So I'm glad I did. So I got my car back yesterday afternoon late. Good. And so my new table came in too. So I get to go buy some wheels and then a brass handle so I can play this meets the definition of the push cart they're requiring me to have game. So oh, cool. Of course, yeah, today all the get around the rules should happen.
Right. Okay. Well, good. And you do have your ticket for Helena, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Good. It is going to be amazing. I'm sure. I spend all my time thinking about it, and it's just going to go by us so fast that we won't even know what hit us.
Right.
But it's going to be fun. Good morning, everyone out there in YouTube land. Jordan and I are just talking about the Creator's Art, a confluence of art, psychology, and renewal that we will be putting on or participating in Helena, Montana on the 10th to 14th of June of this year. Our friend Tim Holmes, who lives there, says that in June, Montana puts on her prom dress. And so it should be quite nice. He says it's before fire season there. But speaking of fires, how are you in New Mexico, Jordan?
Well, we've got, I think, over 100,000 acres burning right now. Yeah. They were all primarily over to the west, near Santa Fe, both sides of Santa Fe, and south and west and north, all around Albuquerque. And there was one in, I think, Ocate Creek that was over the mountain from us, but that's from a wind perspective far away. It's not at us. But now Mora, M-O-R-A, they had a prescribed control burn that is now an out of control burn.
Oh, goody.
Yeah. So I hope it wasn't, fire marshal lights a wooden match and holds it up, and it lasted for half a second and went out. Oh, it's good weather. I mean, I don't want to blame them, because the wind's picking up. The winds have been down like mid-morning to early afternoon. Yeah. And I gather that they started somewhere around in that time. And then in the afternoons, they're now kind of anomalously jumping up and to very, very high gusts. So we've got one in Mora.
How far away is this from any of yours, I think?
It's close enough that we're getting smoke, like straight in.
Okay.
And and close enough that we have like the woman who does my beard thing, she's got a thing this week to drop off eye drops and hygiene products and canned goods. And I mean, it's that bad just all of a sudden there. So
yeah, that's kind of what Tim says about Helena starting in July. That's fire season, and
Yeah.
they have a lot of smoke up there. So, but June will be fine. June is going to be beautiful, and
New Mexico's spring it says spring/fire season.
Okay.
and it goes through the summer. So I mean, so the high winds are the real problem. I mean, gusts of over 70 miles an hour in places.
Okay, we're on part 5 of Answer to Job. We're still very far from halfway through it, but we're making progress. And so today we're going to read from paragraph 628 if you've gotten a copy of the book. I have mine in front of me, and I know Jordan has a copy. And what is that you're holding up?
Oh, it's my glasses.
Oh, your glasses. Okay.
It's the slimmest fountain pen you've ever seen.
Right. I'm trying to decide whether this is a new microphone or what.
Oh, how funny. It does like a little bitty mic. Too funny.
Okay. So paragraph 628. The older son of the first parents was corrupted by Satan and not much of a success. He was an eidolon of Satan, and only the younger son, Abel, was pleasing to God. In Cain, the God image was distorted, but in Abel, it was considerably less dimmed. If Abel was thought of as a copy of God, then God's successful son, who served as a model for Abel, and about whom, as we have seen, there are no available documents, is the prefiguration of the God-man. Okay, so this is the prefiguration of the God-man. Of the latter, we know positively that the Logos, he is pre-existent and co-eternal with God, indeed of the same substance as he. One can therefore regard Abel as the imperfect prototype of God's son, who is about to be begotten in Mary. Just as Yahweh originally undertook to create a chthonic equivalent of himself in the first man, Adam, so now he intends something similar, but much better. The extraordinary precautionary measures above mentioned are designed to serve this purpose. The new son, Christ, shall on the one hand be a chthonic man like Adam, mortal and capable of suffering, but on the other hand, he shall not be like Adam, a mere copy, but God himself, begotten by himself as the Father, and rejuvenating the Father as the Son. As God, he has always been God, and as the Son of Mary, who is plainly a copy of Sophia, he is the Logos, synonymous with Nous, who, like Sophia, is a master workman, as stated by the Gospel according to St. John. Footnote, John 1:3. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. This identity of mother and son is borne out over and over again in the mess. Okay, that's paragraph 628. Jordan, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, before we get to the eidolon, I think which is important, I think what's interesting here, one of the few places I've seen where Mary is then equated to Sophia so directly as a creatrix. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, the virgin birth makes more sense because you get Lilith and Eve marrying the moon to begin and that kind of thing. And the moon at that point would be masculine. And so here that without a husband, Mary equivalent to Sophia, or then further back Shekinah, the original female godhead. I think that's important to, in a sense, elucidate what basically step around physics and birth, for Mary and the virgin birth, and make it not so much of a magic thinking gig. I mean, thoughts there?
Well, obviously these are very early Iron Age men, even before the Iron Age, who were working this out. And so, I don't feel that they had the people that were writing these things down had a very clear idea of what they were saying and what the meaning was, and how things would be taken in the modern world. And,
that's a really, really good point, because then it makes kind of a quasi allusion to back when the visual language was still more present, symbols and story.
Right.
So that, story, even though it could be misconstrued, would be continued rather than just taken wrongly. I mean, it would get off track over centuries, or, or over even decades. But you're right. Then as they start to write things down, they're living in a basically picture languageville, and writing in a logos textual languageville city. And I think you make a good point there, because there's a lot that's lost in translation.
Oh, huge.
Just because they're not so adept at the writing, they're more adept at the telling. And the telling is more of the painting and the visual of the story. Right. Yeah, that's a good point you brought up there, because I hadn't thought about that with linguistic acumen, as it were,
Right. And not only linguistic acumen, but scientific acumen. I mean, these guys didn't know what was going on in the world. Right. And they didn't know how things worked really in the scientific sense. And so they were trying to express something. And so, men in the time of Christ, or let's say the time from Job until Christ, because according to Jung's take on this, in answer to Job, it was Yahweh's interaction with Job that ultimately evoked the idea of Jesus Christ, and the idea that God had to become man. And it took 500 years for this idea to evolve in human beings, if you will.
Well, that's interesting to me, because sociologically, you're playing a whole nother tune there that I think is not spoken about much, where we are dealing with people who they're still just living in nature predominantly, whereas we have kind of come out of nature to then turn back to describe nature, and there are the perils in that too. But the earth is still flat to some of them. The universe revolves around the earth to some of them. And I think we all know that the earth's not flat, because if it was, cats would have already knocked everything off of it by now. But but you're right there, because of the language, and also the awareness of how the environment works is present, but it's young, very young.
Right. Okay. So a couple surprises I want to give you, but before I give you the surprise, let's talk about the eidolon of Satan, because I don't think that word is very known to people. Eidolon. I had to look it up myself. And so what the Oxford Dictionary says is an idealized person or thing, or a specter or phantom. And so this is the idealized version of Satan. Okay, is what Jung is saying here, and it was requiring. And at the time of Job, which this book is talking about the answer to Job, it is God realizes that he has to become man. He can't be some idealized thing up in the sky, the sky father. Right. And let's keep in mind that as we go through Jung's own evolution, instead of man being made in the image of God, God is made in the image of man, right? And
it's a total persona.
Pardon?
Total personification.
Right. And the point to me, and I only take me for responsibility for this, but to my point is that we all need a savior. Okay, we all need somebody to pull us out of the soup. Okay, and pull us out of the chaos of life and give us some direction, some container in that sense. And so, I've pointed out to others that Debbie has been my savior for the last 36 years, but in some ways, Tim has been a savior to me over the last year. It was a year ago today that I was flying back to Baltimore and trying to figure out what I was going to do with this experience that I had had in Helena a week before, the previous day, because I was only in Helena for one day or a bit more, 32 hours. And it was such an intense experience for me that I knew something had to come of it, but I didn't know what. And so that's now it's going to manifest as the confluence in Helena, and from that confluence is going to manifest other events, something like this. And so as I was thinking about the Savior, I was thinking about, believe it or not, the song of the Hollies called, it's Bob Dylan's song, and you'll see why he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And when he did, he very kindly and generously did not go to receive the Nobel Prize, because as some of the other people, scientists who had won Nobel Prizes that year, said if he had come, he would have sucked all the air out of the room. And
the personality, the glitz, pardon? The personality and the popularity and the basically, right. Ooh, shiny, I mean, it's like,
yeah. And so, and I'm going to talk about that now in a different way, which is I'm going to talk about one of Dylan's songs, which has always been a favorite of mine. And I think a lot of people don't know they know it, and they don't know it's beloved to them. But I'm talking about Quinn the Eskimo, or the Mighty Quinn. The Mighty Quinn is the name of the song. And in a moment, I'll give you a nice link to listen to the Hollies sing this song. But I'm going to go through the poetry of Dylan's ideas and talk about the Savior and how this all comes together. And, the idea is, if you look at John 1:1, I was recently talking to a pastor and saying, the idea of God being a word just leaves me totally cold. I don't, I don't know, where did that idea come from? And she was saying, oh no, those words are, if you take them in deeply, then you feel it. Okay. And I acknowledge that because I had done a calligraphy work over the last few months of John 1 through 14, as you know. And as I did that, it did make it more real to me.
And also, I think that's a really good point for you to pick out, that the difficulty of God as a word, because we use words all the time. So a word would be very mundane, very, very non-descriptive of, what do you mean? One word is all. But when you get into the Hebrew, Yahweh, each character is a whole world. And then, and the concepts, there's a lot of concepts of
well, there's symbols of a whole world.
Well, exactly. There's symbols of a whole world. And then you get a lot of these quote unquote words that actually become like Om. It's not O-M, it's A-U-M
space.
Right, except it's A space, U space, M space. And then it's really space A, space U, space M space, and then the space above and below. And then because of that, the space is the silence, capital S, silence.
Right.
And so it's called the 4-character voice of the universe. And people always say, well, there are only 3 letters. Well, fourth letter is that silence that's in between, within, outside, and all around. And so the word, capital W, that would be God, expresses also what it doesn't express. It's silent. So I think that's the trickster there.
And I had an experience with Van Cliburn. Cliburn is this super famous pianist from the middle to late 20th century. And he had won a major international piano award in Russia. And so I went to see him one time in the Kleinhans Music Hall in Buffalo, New York. And after the concert, he was asked, what distinguishes you from, the average piano player? And he said, well, everybody can play the notes, but I play the spaces between the notes. Right. And it really dovetails with your idea of Om here and what you're talking about in Om.
And I love the Van Cliburn example, because if I even break it down to like my concept of what's relationship, what's connection, the thing is, when things are touching, they're not in a relationship anymore. They're touching. It's the things around them. The touch becomes a connection. But when things have just a bit of space between them, there's a vessel of nothingness in between them, but they're both poured into the vessel together. And that's then relational. So he's then playing the literal empty vessels of harmonics by how far he takes these notes towards and away from each other, so that there's a different kind of timbre of sound just between 2 notes. And then when you extend that chords and to sequences, he really does have more of the sensitivity to like a watercolorist, making sure they're taking care of the white space. Don't paint everything. Let some things come into being in the imagination. And I feel Van Cliburn was a great example of bringing music into being from an imaginal place where you get a more robust experience simply because of how he's attenuated to his own poetry.
So Kushbu is here, and happy Mother's Day, Kushbu. Kushbu is the mother of 9 dogs in her home, and she's recently started a dog biscuit business in Bangalore, India. And I was on the phone with her last night for about a half hour at midnight. And so I'm glad to see she's here still with me today. She hasn't been to sleep since that because she had her full day while I slept. But anyway, it's nice to see you today, Fishboom.
Thanks for taking care of the doggies.
And now we're going to talk about how each and every one of us can, I would say the word is disambiguate a poem so that it has a spiritual content for you. And the poem, the song, is only a 3-minute song, but it's called The Mighty Quinn by Dylan. And as I was saying, all of us need a savior. And what Quinn, and for my generation, the Mighty Quinn is beloved. And we don't know why, because in many cases, we can't even hear the words when it's sung by a rock group. And by Dylan in his own inimical style. But I wanted to take the poem line by line and disambiguate it and let you see that the Mighty Quinn is actually about the coming of the Messiah or the Savior. And in this sense, it's the coming of, I guess it's a mundane savior in some way because it's talking about a physical person, but we all need that. We all need a savior. And so I have many, as I say, people that have pulled my bacon out of the fire many times.
That's such an expressive example of when those times happen. That's
okay. So I'm just going to go through the poem. Then I will give everybody the link for the song on YouTube. You can go back. You can go out and listen to it in 3 minutes and miss 3 minutes of George's and my dialogue, and then you can come back. But here are the words. Okay. So it begins, everybody's building big ships and boats. Okay, so disambiguated, everyone is focused on the temporal world, the logos. Some are building monuments, others are jotting down notes. Everybody's in despair, and that translates to everybody's in despair. Every girl and boy, everyone is in despair. But when Quinn the Eskimo gets here, and the disambiguation is, but when the Savior comes, everybody's going to jump for joy. We'll all be happy. We'll be happy when we're saved, or when the Savior comes, or we get a temporal world Savior, which is what we all need all the time. So then the chorus, come all without, come all within. That's exactly what we're talking about in our confluence of art and psychology. It's exactly what we're talking about in Jungian psychology, which is you have to think about it in the physical world and also in the psychic world. You'll not see nothing like the Mighty Quinn. Everyone in Christianity and Judaism has an image of what it will mean, what it will be like when the Messiah comes. And so there's always, all of us in the Western world that are the least bit religious know about the Messiah. And so we all have an idea of that. But Dylan is talking about the Messiah metaphorically, so he doesn't get in trouble. So the Messiah in this case is the mighty Quinn. So the second line of the poem is, "You'll not see nothing like the mighty Quinn," which is, you won't see anything like the Messiah, because everybody's idea of the Messiah is different, but everybody needs a Messiah. Okay, second verse. "I like to do just like the rest. I like my sugar sweet." So he says, I'm just like everybody else. And then he goes on, "But guarding fumes and making haste ain't my cup of meat." Which is his way of saying, but I'm not happy with modern society. I'm just like everybody, and I'm not satisfied with modern society, which assuredly is exactly where all of us are, one way or another.
Right.
And then the critical lines: "Everybody's just standing around neath the trees, feeding pigeons on a limb." And that disambiguates to nobody knows what to do. And I expand on that by saying, we're all marking time feeding pigeons, as in life itself, out on a dangerous limb, because we have climate change, gun violence, you pick, i.e. the vision in Aikido, someone is running from a bear, but comes to a cliff. He sees the branch halfway down, so he jumps to it. Then he realizes there's a tiger at the bottom of the cliff, every bit as threatening as the bear. But finally, he sees that on the vine he's holding onto, there is a ripe raspberry. He reaches out and eats the raspberry. Delicious. This is usually depicted with just a branch from a ripe raspberry. For them's nose. Okay, so if you know anything about Aikido, you'll know this story, but we're all out on a limb and we're all in crisis, like that person. Okay.
And in Aikido too, there's never an opponent. You are fighting with the universe. You are basically not fighting. You are always connected with the universe. So when he turns to reach to the tiniest, ripe, delicious detail of that berry, he has basically connected. He is nature, and now there are just three animals there. There's no threat.
Yeah. Okay. So the second Dylan line here: "But when Quinn the Eskimo gets here, them pigeons will go to him." So disambiguates as, but when the Savior comes, we'll all flock to him because we're all out on the same limb. And then the chorus comes again. I'm not going to repeat what I said about the chorus. Okay, so third verse: "A lamb bleat and a goat do. I can recite them all." And so disambiguated is, I can recite the ills of the world. And just tell me where it hurts. In modern life, we have a pill for everything. And I'll tell you who to call. All you need is the yellow pages. So nobody can get any sleep, but we're all still filled with angst and foreboding. There's someone on everyone's toes. Everyone has a trespasser against us. Okay. And so you hear that every week in church. If you go to church, there's someone on everyone's toes. But when Quinn the Eskimo gets here, but when the Savior comes, everybody's going to doze. We can all relax. And so then the chorus goes twice. Okay, so that's my disambiguation of a song which probably nobody thought about what it meant until now, and fair enough. But it's pointing out the significance of words and spaces of words, and reflecting on words so that you understand what they mean. And so I'm going to just give the link to the Hollies, and I'm sure this will cause most of our audience to spend 3 minutes out somewhere else on YouTube while they listen to this. But
Well, I'm glad you brought up the Mighty Quinn and went through line by line, because to me, in that song, the most important line, I think, to modern culture, from my perspective, and even to me, was the all just people standing under the tree feeding pigeons. Because my disambiguation of that line is that people are standing around nourishing this forgotten and unknown connection to nature, but they naturally can't not do it. So there's this feeding the pigeons is this mundane way of saying, I miss nature. I don't know what I'm missing. I've never seen nature. I mean, someone on the inner city who's always seen asphalt, concrete, and chain link, and brick, might never have seen green. And
Right.
so but they're like, oh, look, a pigeon, here's some bread. I mean, how did that happen? There's this connection that I think is natural. So
Right.
it's,
Well, there was my longest term friend in life is a man who's going to be at the confluence this year, and you'll have an opportunity to meet him. But he, mind you, I went to a school filled with Navy dependents, right? People that had a military father, right? Typically.
right.
And some civilians who worked for the Navy primarily. And so essentially all the men in the class got in the military sometime in the next 4 years after we graduated from high school. And only this one man went to Canada, okay, to avoid being drafted. And he still lives there. That happened in 1967. And I did not see him for 30 years, but he was quite important to me in my youth, because when I arrived in Japan, I was 15 years old, and I was in my French class, and all of a sudden a big wad of paper hit me on the side of the head. And I was sitting there very dour and serious.
I know that.
Dour and serious in French class, and my friend Ray threw the spitball at me, and it had the effect of bringing me into life, okay, and bringing me into the community of the young people that were in that high school at the time. And all of us in that class and classes before and after us all had some sort of experience with Ray that was numinous. Okay, everybody did. And so in 1994, we had a reunion in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, and Ray was working up in northern Saskatchewan at the time. He was an amazing guy. He became a biologist, and he convinced Weyerhaeuser to stop using pesticides on their forests and to instead use sheep. And so for quite a while, he and his wife, with the help of Australian sheep herders, in the summertime in the U.S., which is winter in Australia, they would come up and they would work these sheep, and they would have this immense flock of sheep that would eat its way up through, basically up through British Columbia. So he was in Saskatchewan, I think, at that time, either picking up or returning sheep to the farmers who owned them. But the sheep, the sheep kept growing their wool. So the farmers were happy because Ray would take the sheep away for about 5 months. The sheep would eat the undergrowth of the forest, thereby preventing insects from getting up on the trees. And then at the end of the summer, he'd pack up these sheep and take them back to the farmers so they could be sheared.
And yeah, the farmers are getting paid for the off time and for the shearing time. I mean,
Absolutely.
and the ground, the trees are being no insects, and the ground is being nourished by, well, what are sheep going to do when they eat? Well, they
right, right. Plus they had labor, because they were bringing these sheep herders up from Australia for this purpose. So anyway, Ray was quite a unique, or is quite a unique individual, and I communicate with either him or his wife daily, and have done since 1994, pretty much. But in 1994, we had a reunion in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, and none of us had seen one another. We had 5 classes present from this Navy high school in Yokohama, and 5 classes present, but none of us had seen one another for 30 years. And so Ray, at the spur of the moment, decided he would come to this reunion. And so he, on the Friday night of this reunion, he decides he's going to start driving down from Saskatchewan to Glenwood Springs, Colorado, which is a 24-hour drive. And so one of my classmates was giving us reports like every 2 hours. This was before cell phones. So every couple hours, Ray would call in and tell our other friend where he was. And so we kept getting these every 2-hour reports. Well, Ray's in such and such place, Ray's in such and such place. Finally, Ray arrives, and this friend of ours basically tackles him and takes him in one of the large meeting rooms in Glenwood Springs, sits him down. Somebody brought him a plate of food, and he started to talk. And immediately, 200 people formed around Ray and just listened with rapt attention. I think partially because we had all followed the collective thing to do for our class, which was to join the military, and he hadn't. So he was the opposite, and we wanted to know, what his life had been about. But every time I think of that event and how everybody came to Ray, I think of Quinn the Eskimo. So that's why I talk about it. But anyway.
Well, and he's also, I have to say, because I know the story of Weyerhaeuser just as an architect. And then when I realized that you knew him, it was, wow. So to me, one of his brilliances is that he utilizes natural solutions.
Yeah.
Now, that sounds really mundane and simple to some people, but just the logistics of, well, these Aussie sheep, and we get them across the big pond, and we bring them over, and we're then greasing the wheels of 3 industries: the sheep herders, Weyerhaeuser's forest, and nature as an industry that's contributing, because the sheep are eating, obviously, and that's that you're minusing out. Okay, here's our sheep feed. We don't need that. It's on the ground. Nature gives us that. But that right there is even an overgeneralized, simplistic view of what he did there, because what he did there has so many umpteen million calculus connections that feed it. And again, come within, come without, all over that solution. So yeah, I appreciate you bringing him up, and especially in light of this paragraph and the mighty Quinn, and also the capital O other. Right. He didn't follow. He led just a different path, which is, I think, so important. And
right, and mind you, a lot of people think that I would be angry and disenchanted with Ray, but that's not true at all, because in the fullness of time, I realized that the people who were protesting the war were right. Right. Okay. I mean, I was stuck in the collective and had been, brought up in the collective of the military
Right.
in the immediate years after World War II. And so for our families, war was a serious thing. And somebody had to be responsible for being properly trained to defend the country. And so I never second guessed that. But when I was in college, I went to this little lefty college, we say, where despite the fact that with one exception, I'm the most liberal person I know, the I was the right wing at that college because I joined the Marines. Everybody else was way out to the left from me. And nowadays, ironically, after 55 years or however many years it's been, or 54 years, after 54 years now, I'm the lefty and everybody else is the right one, by an undue. So anyway, all right, so let's go on. Do you have your book there?
I do. Before we go on, just want to bring up that Eidolon of Satan piece.
Okay.
Just simply because you get here, Satan, drops down to the earth, the caretaker of the earth. In modern times, we've made it evil, but there's a of the earth, which is more pagan, which then the Eidolon, the specter, the idolized person, is the contrast to then Abel. So Cain as the idealized person, Abel is then the idealized person in the eyes of God. And so then you get the difference of opinion there in a way, so to speak, and kind of a little bit. But at the same time, I think that in Cain, the God image was distorted. Well, what's interesting is I think distorted is an interesting word there. And I agree with Jung there. But distorted also means you're begging for discussion of different perspectives on, well, distorted from what? So what's God in the first place? So I just wanted to bring that up there's a lot in that Eidolon piece where Eidolon of Satan versus Eidolon of God, and between Cain and Abel. And what's the old Cain, nature will kill you. I mean, nature's it's deadly. I mean, life is fatal. We're all mortal. But the old joke of it goes something like, I'm not afraid of nature. I know it'll kill me. I'm afraid of people because they try to get my trust before they do so. It's like, so something like that. So I just think bringing up that is important for further thought with people, because I think there's a lot that people can teach themselves even from just looking at that first Eidolon, Eidolon, and Eidolon also in the Mighty Quinn, and make those connections that you've brought forth here today.
Yep. Right.
I just wanted to bring that up before we move on.
Okay. All right. So we're going to go to paragraph 629.
Okay. Well, this is wild. Okay. I see better with my eyes instead of the exercises are working. Okay. Paragraph 629. Although the birth of Christ is an event that occurred but once in history, it has always existed in eternity. For the layman in these matters, the identity of a non-temporal, eternal event with a unique historical occurrence is something that is extremely difficult to conceive. He must, however, accustom himself to the idea that, quote unquote, time is a relative concept and needs to be complemented by that of the, quote unquote, simultaneous existence in the bardo or pleroma of all historical processes. What exists in the pleroma is an eternal process. What exists in the pleroma as an internal process appears in time as an aperiodic sequence. That is to say, it is repeated many times in an irregular pattern. To take but one example, Yahweh had one good son and one who was a failure. Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau correspond to this prototype. And so in all ages and in all parts of the world does the motif of the hostile brothers, which is innumerable, which in innumerable modern variants still causes dissension in families and keeps the psychotherapist busy.
Right.
Just as many examples, no less instructive, could be found for the two women prefigured in eternity when these things occur as modern variants. Therefore, they should not be regarded merely as personal episodes, moods, or chance idiosyncrasies in people, but as fragments of the pleromatic process itself, which, broken up into individual events occurring in time, is an essential component or aspect of the divine drama. Yeah, it's amazing that two brothers or two sisters ever make it out of adolescence alive.
Right. And, and I remember very clearly when I was growing up having all kinds of fights with my brother. And I surely regret those now because we lost him when he was 39. And so I miss him very much now. As we grew up and got into our teen years, we became sort of like Tweedledum and Tweedledee. I mean, we were very close in our early and mid-teens while I was in high school, and he was in high school too. He was 2 years behind me, and then I went off to college, and that was sort of the end of it. And so he came along finishing college at a time when the economy was in the tank, couldn't find a job, went to Vail, Colorado, and went skiing for 15 years and working construction in the summer times, made a good life for himself. But anyway, he got Giardia from the Colorado River, and it ate his liver. And so he died at age 39 after having had 3 liver transplants. Today we could have saved him. Modern science would allow for a partial liver transplant. So I could have given him a part of my liver, which would have grown back. But in those days, they hadn't thought of that. And that was actually
also now we know that Giardia is the cold weather version of Pseudomonas, the other fatal pink fungus or bacteria. And the thing is, it ends up being systemic. So they have to clean the filter of the body, because even with a new liver, the body will then refeed the new liver with all the Giardia that's just normally passing through, because it's not just in the liver, but the liver then filtering it. The body still has a whole store of it that it's grown.
Right.
So there's
So anyway, we're talking about the pleroma here. So the pleroma is a psychological place. I close my eyes and I imagine the limits of space. And if I close my eyes and just allow myself to meditate, I can see the limits of space, and out there it is the pleroma. And Jung's point is that this is the hostile brothers is one archetype of thousands of archetypes that is pretty strong in human beings, and it happens in every family. Or every family where they're brothers, and typically with sisters too, although the sisters seem to do better.
Well, Well, and I always call that, the brother and the sister civil wars, as they were.
Mhm.
I always call that beating out the gold from the ore, because
Yeah.
after years of push and pull, hammering, literally, and in your case from someone else, but literally hammering the ore to separate the gold, and then to form the gold, and then you're Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Then you're one gold and he's another gold, and you walk off, into the sunset, so to speak. So there's a certain, I think, discipline of the ritual where even the brothers self-induce their own rites of passage as to who they are, and they become each more and more themselves, and more acceptant of the other after a long battle.
Right on. Okay, so what happened in the case of Mary and Jesus is that just the right things happened in their lives, so that they were, as Jung says here, they were sort of together. They were an identity. And it was only possible for these two people at that time to be what they were. But nonetheless, as I indicated earlier, we all need a savior, and we all have them in, at least with a small s, in our spouses and our friends and our teachers, what have you. And we have to recognize that that's what they are to us.
Well, and earlier, I think that's a really good point. I think, to clarify, at least from my perspective, the savior is not the handing over of, someone, looking up to the mommy and daddy in the sky to say, save you, so to speak. I wrote down savior, parents, lover, friend, inspiration, creativity, self,
Absolutely.
other, mighty Quinn, Messiah, where there's a partnering with something larger in a savior that has nothing to do with giving up your own sense of responsibility. So I kind of feel like there's, the person who has the savior and they have a strong ego and they get along just fine. And the person who has a savior and a weak ego strength end up really asking everyone else to solve their problems. And
Right.
instead of connecting with others to solve problems together. If you wake up every day and it's always a problem, you need to wake up I don't need, that's a probably wrong word to use here, but I feel it's important to wake up and, well, what am I going to do that's inspiration, that makes my world a better place, and not always waking up to solve problems, because I think that one is boring. And
so this is in part speaks to the cachet of Donald Trump, okay, because so many people who are adults now have felt left out of the economy, let's say, because the last 40 years, the GOP has moved our industry to China. Basically, that's what they did. And that caused the Rust Belt of Middle America, and it caused a lot of rage and resentment. And so when people see this plane flying over with Trump's name on it and everything, they expected him to be a savior. But he was never about being a savior. He was always in it for himself.
Right. Well, right.
And so therefore, in a sense, he is the eidolon of Satan in our living physical sense today. But and
I'd say
half of our country doesn't see that.
Well, I agree wholeheartedly there. But what I also find is interesting is Bone Spurs, and he didn't survive that kind of brother-brother relationship. he's more little Lloyd Fauntleroy. So he's an eidolon also of the malaise of laziness. And third generation after World War II was that strong men create, strong men are warriors, strong women are warriors. They create easier times. Easier times create lazy people. Lazy people create trouble. Trouble creates more strong people to create better times. He's in that slothful last piece where, I mean, I hate to compliment Cain for killing Abel, but I don't think that he has that kind of base discernment. He kills, it's like death of a thousand slices, death of a thousand cuts. And most of them by he's never finished a whole sentence in his life. So we really never know what he's talking about. It's either noun and object or noun and verb, but there's no object. So, I mean, what the heck's he even saying, And so he's, he's playing on superstition, really, because if I look at it.
That's right. And I think the important thing that you're saying here, and I'm also saying, is that, yes, the generation that saved democracy in World War II was the greatest generation. And then they produced my generation, which had a little different cut on things, right?
Right.
And then we produced the generation of soccer moms where everybody gets a trophy, and
just for
so
breathing.
Pardon? Just for breathing. Yeah, geez, my little Johnny is going to feel bad if he doesn't get a trophy, so we have to give him a trophy, even though he is worth the breath, right? And so
well, I have to say the gold nuggets in that generation too, of the getting too many trophies, the people there who are like, this is absurd. The ones that are there are making the new great generation kind of thing.
Well, and now we're seeing the children of that generation, the everybody gets a trophy generation, are saying, now wait a minute, you're leaving us a world that's falling apart and that's got a war going in the other side of the world, and it's totally destructive, and we've got to step up. And so this new generation, perhaps the fourth generation after World War II, is going to be a very strong one again, because it's going to have to pick up.
And I also see it in their, instead of bitching, they have a hilarious perspective where, the whole, when I was your age, I walked uphill both ways to school every day, and then you see now the posters are my parents' view of going to school, and it's these four naked people walking up Mount Everest. It's like, it's no longer just out on a farm road. And so then in a sense, they can poke fun, but in that beautiful exaggerated way, which means they're playing with their trouble and they're playing with the other person's perspective, instead of you had it harder than me. They're like, well, fine, here's your story.
So it's archetypal, and it's, if you look at history, it's always archetypal that the third generation after a powerful king is effete. And sometimes it's the second generation, as in the case of Queen Elizabeth's children, because her father was George VI, who was the sovereign through World War II. She came along, and she had been a mechanic and all kinds of things during the war, so she lived a real life, and so she was the second generation, and she's held up the banner quite well for her lifetime. But now we're going to get the effete generation, which comes behind her, which is Charles, and then it's quite obvious that William and Kate are going to be quite different, okay, from what their uncles or his uncles and father are like. We got Prince Andrew, who was fooling around with Jeffrey Epstein and that kind of stuff. Jesus, that's the effete generation there. And so William and Kate are now the fourth generation. They're like the generation that we're seeing in the U.S., which is now going to pick up the fallen yoke, or pick up the fallen banner, and change the country to be what it needs to be. Okay.
Well, and I like that, pick up the fallen yoke. But you're meaning YOKE, but I like with everyone, hard-boiled egg is always yellow inside. Pick up that yoke too. Like, right. How are we going to grow a new world?
Yeah, and it's obvious that some people are stepping up now during the Ukraine-Russia war, and it's obvious that the repair of the world, which is one of the key concepts of the play that I'm performing in Helena is about, is how do we reform the world, and how do we recognize that somehow we screwed up, and the next generation is going to have to figure it out and solve the problems themselves. We don't have the answers. My generation.
Yeah, I like to look at that too, instead of and I agree. But I think instead of going through blame storming, as I call it, through shame storming to you lazy, blah, blah, blah. If I look at it more like a garden, there are times with a garden or a field where things have to lie fallow to re-nourish. And if it's all on all the time, okay, that would indicate probably utopia. But at the same time, the pie in the sky of that is there's no natural cycle to re-inform each other's cycle of the other different ways it could have gone. So I think there's a piece there too.
Right on. Okay, so let's go on. We only have two more paragraphs, and fortunately I've arranged it this morning so you get the one that's a page and a half. And
You're welcome.
I have the paragraph that's only 10 lines long, but let me read that. So it's paragraph 613. When Yahweh created the world from his Prima Materia, the void, he could not help breathing his own mystery into the creation, which is himself in every part, as every reasonable theology has long been convinced. From this comes the belief that it is possible to know God from his creation. When I say that we could not help doing this, I do not imply any limitation of his omnipotence. On the contrary, it is an acknowledgement that all possibilities are contained in him, and that there are, in consequence, no other possibilities than those which express him. Okay. You want to speak to that, Jordan?
Yeah, I like the Prima Materia being the void, because as we spoke before, it's that space between bringing things into relationships. Van Cliburg's playing the spaces between the notes, bringing the music into a more sacred and inspirational or inspiring relationship. So I think really, to me, the Prima Materia, not being now so abstract here, if I equate it with the void, it's the interstice, the space between that fool's leap of every nerve impulse between, neuron to neuron, as it goes electrically across the little void inside that is, basically interlaced over the big void in the gray matter, as it were.
Absolutely.
Places where there is nothing. And it reminds me of the Irish proverb. I think it goes, may the ground always rise up to support your every step. And adding to that, when there was no ground before, when you first began to step. So there's a trust piece, I think, where that But I like the prima materia. We always think of that. I always thought of that early on as an object. What is the prima materia? Tell me what it is. And that's being the subject to the curse of modern physics. I want to solve, I want to show, I want to explain, I want to produce. And that's object. But the void is that dark matter, is that place of nothingness that's actually
the prima materia was the singularity that existed before the Big Bang.
Right. And I like
that's the prima
materia as that dense piece that's everything equated then with the nothingness of the void. So you take the both and, in a sense, the prima materia and the void could be those, civil warring brothers and sisters, because they're completely different. And there's then the mystery. He could not help breathing his own mystery into the creation. So that really caught my eye.
Yeah. And so what I want to point out here is, as I agree with Jung here, that there are no other possibilities than those which express God, him, that express him. And the point is this: you can learn a lot about psychology. You can learn a lot about physics. You can explain everything. I mean, mansplaining is a favorite activity of most of most men, right? And so the theory is that somehow we could explain everything ultimately, but in the end, that is not true. Okay. In the end, no matter how far you break things down to the vastness of space or the minuscule area of the Higgs boson, no matter which way you go, every which way but loose, there's still a mystery.
Mm-hmm.
There's still a mystery. How was that singularity there? Okay. Where did that come from? And it seems to me that in our lifetimes, it's very likely that we will never know the answer to that. I mean, we can have some nice ideas about it. Of course, people posit something called the multiverse, and they can prove it to you mathematically, but that doesn't mean that what they imagine is physically true. And so at bottom, there's always a mystery, and I don't want anything that I say to detract from that fact. Okay.
Well, and I wholeheartedly agree there, because when I look at mansplaining and when I hear mansplaining, I just shut my mouth and kind of grin. And to me, it always feels like the impetus of the mansplaining is that person is afraid of the mystery. That first person is afraid of the silence. They are uncomfortable thinking people think they don't know enough. They have to prove themselves. And to me, I always feel, and it's not, well, maybe not always, but I'm always, well, which parent are you still processing? Why can't you be comfortable enough to just settle down and settle in and be comfortable with the not knowing? Because I find the mansplaining, and I laugh, as long as I'm speaking here right now, I'm kind of doing it in a way, but the talking about the fear of silence and the fear of actually observing and experiencing, which in that sense is kind of a prayerful watching, where I think you get a more robust experience. And in a sense, for example, Van Cliburn's music, Playing the Spaces Between, would not be mansplained in a piece, whereas someone playing Mozart's Für Elise as fast as they can is kind of a mansplaining music. It's let me show you instead of getting the heart of the matter.
Well, Van Cliburn can't actually show you. He can say what he thinks his je ne sais quoi is that gives him the ability to win a piano contest, surely. And, that's his opinion of, that's his perception of his genius. But he can't train 10 Van Cliburns. Okay. That has to come from within. And so he can bring you right up to the precipice and say, okay, now if you play this sonata or this piano concerto, Beethoven's Fifth Piano Concerto is one of my favorites. If he can bring you up to the precipice of playing that in front of an audience, but in the end, it's you that has to do it. And then comes the quote from the movie Chariots of Fire, where Eric Liddell is having in his brain, as he's in a very, very hard race where he's been knocked down by one of the other participants, and he thinks to himself, so where does the power come from to see the race through to the end? From within. Okay. And it's from within all of us. And so it's absolutely necessary that everyone understand that, no matter what you and I say, no matter what we mansplain, no matter what you hear from any physicist or what have you, in the end, the answer has to come from within you. And so that's why Dr. Jung answered his question when he was asked, does he believe in God? And his answer was, I have no need to believe, I know. Okay, now, what that means is that he doesn't have to believe anybody's hocus pocus about what God is. Okay, he knows. And he also knows that he can't explain it to anybody else. Okay. And it was a mystical moment for me, a numinous moment for me, when I saw him on video on YouTube saying that, because I said, oh, I too know. And then I had to spend the next 10 years trying to work out what it was I know. And in the end, I came to the conclusion that it is ineffable. It's not explainable. So you either grok it or you don't, but nobody's going to teach it to you. And so we can point you in the right direction, but if you want to know God, you have to step off the cliff by yourself. Okay. Yeah,
like Debbie's the
vanishing path. Yeah,
the vanishing path, and I think the vanishing path then goes, back to your Chariots of Fire. Where does the power come from? Which connects directly to the raspberry with the bear, the tiger, and the cliff. And
right. Okay. So I'm gonna let you read this long paragraph here, and I'm going to step away for a moment.
You'll be back tomorrow when I finish this paragraph.
When you finish the paragraph. Okay, keeping in mind, everyone, that Dr. Jung was trying to explain in each of his paragraphs one idea, but his idea of a paragraph was a cheese ball that has all kinds of nuts and fruits and dried raisins in it and everything, and so you have to go pick at it to try to understand it. I mean,
I will say, with a forward-looking perspective, if we continue at this tennis match pace, and then my next reading after yours, I'll get one that's 1 1/4 lines long.
Okay, fair enough. That's fair. Yeah, but uh, in the beginning was the Word, and the
Right.
Word was God, and was with God, and the Word was God. With Jung, in the beginning was a hell of a lot of words.
In the beginning was a dictionary, and then the dictionary expanded to be this tome of an encyclopedic word, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So,
Right. Okay,
right.
so I'm going to turn it over to you and be back shortly.
Sounds good. So paragraph 631, all the world is God's, and God is in all the world from the very beginning. Why then the tour de force of the incarnation? One asks oneself, astonished. God is everything already. God is in everything already. And yet there must be something missing if a sort of second entrance into capital C creation has now to be staged with so much care and circumspection. Since creation is universal, reaching to the remotest stellar galaxies, and since it has also made organic life infinitely variable and capable of endless differentiation, we can hardly see where the defect lies. The fact that Satan has everywhere intruded his corrupting influence is no doubt regrettable for many reasons, but it makes no difference in principle. It is not easy to give an answer to this question. One would like to say that Christ had to appear in order to deliver mankind from evil. But when one considers that evil was originally slipped into the scheme of things by Satan and still is, then it would seem much simpler if Yahweh would, for once, call this quote unquote practical joker severely to account, get rid of his pernicious influence, and thus eliminate the root of all evil. He would then not need the elaborate arrangement of a special incarnation with all the unforeseeable consequences which this entails. One should make clear to oneself what it means when God becomes man. It means nothing less than a world-shaking transformation of God. It means more or less what creation meant in the beginning, namely an objectivization of God. At the time of creation, he revealed himself in nature. Now he wants to be more specific and become man. It must be admitted, however, that there was a tendency in this direction right from the start. For when those other human beings who had evidently been created before Adam appeared on the scene along with the higher mammals, Yahweh created on the following day, by a special act of creation, a man who was the image of God. This was the first prefiguration of his becoming man. He took Adam's descendants, especially the people of Israel, into his personal possession. And from time to time, he filled this people's prophets with his spirit. All these things were preparatory events and symptoms of the tendency within God to become man. But in omniscience, there had existed from all eternity a knowledge of the human nature of God or the divine nature of man. That is why, long before Genesis was written, we find corresponding testimonies in the ancient Egyptian records. These intimations and prefigurations of the incarnation must strike one as either completely incomprehensible or superfluous, since all creation ex nihilo is God's and consists of nothing but God, with the result that man, like the rest of creation, is simply God become concrete. Prefigurations, however, are not in themselves creative events, but are only stages in the process of becoming conscious. It was only quite late that we realized, or rather are beginning to realize, that God is reality itself, and therefore, last but not least, man. This realization is a millennial process. Thoughts?
Yeah. So God is reality itself. I mean, this is basically what we were saying. And the problem that we have or we have, is that we've all been taught to think of God as a conscious entity somewhere out there. And the problem is that's not God. There's no such thing. Let's see.
Well, that reminds me of a cartoon I saw yesterday. There's a little kid walking down the street, and he said, well, here's the joke about God. So there's this man in the ocean, and he's drowning, and a ship passes by and said, sir, can we help you? Oh, no, God will save me. And they keep on going. And then, several minutes later, maybe an hour later, he's still drowning, flailing. And another ship passes by. Sir, may we help you? May we pull you from the water and save you from drowning? Oh, no, God will save me. And then, of course, he drowns. And he gets up to heaven, and he gets through St. Peter, and he gets in, and he says, God, why have you forsaken me? Why did you not save me? He goes, for Christ's sakes, I sent you 2 ships.
Right. And there are many wonderful versions of that. So
so that's God is reality. It's like not looking outside. It's, this opportunity just came right here. Okay, I'll climb on the boat. Let's get out of the water.
Right. So Dr. Jung, being the son of a Swiss Reformed pastor, and having 6 or 7 generations of pastors before him, and 7 uncles who were pastors during his lifetime.
A lot of black and white.
I mean, he definitely had drunk the Kool-Aid at the beginning, and it took him a long time to deconstruct his childhood, I'm sure. But finally, near the end of his life in 1956, he did summarize in a very short number of words what he thought about God. And so this being a Jungian study group, let's say, I want to share that with everybody now. And
nice.
I put it in calligraphy. So if after Confluence, if anybody wants a copy of this, you can contact me, and it will be available in print form, not cheap, because making copies of this is not cheap. But in any case, man's relation to God probably has to undergo a certain important change. Instead of propitiating praise to an unpredictable king or a child's prayer to a loving father, the responsible living and fulfilling of the divine will in us will be our form of worship of and commerce with God. His goodness means grace and light, and his dark side, the terrible temptation to power. Man has already received so much knowledge that he can destroy his own planet. Let us hope that God's good spirit will guide him in his decision whether God's creation will continue. And that was a letter on the 30th of June, 1956, to Enid Kochnig, who was a Jungian analyst for about 30 years, I guess, in Los Angeles. But I just put this up on the screen so people will have access to it, and you can go back and find it.
Can you read the last paragraph again?
Read it again?
If you would.
Okay. Man has already received so much knowledge that he can destroy his own planet. Let us hope that God's good spirit will guide him in his decision whether God's creation will continue. Okay, go ahead.
Well, to me, yeah, there's a big giant, there's a really small ellipses, dot, 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 a really giant ellipses, dot, 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 and then on a small one again. So it feels like this last paragraph really drives home that space between, says something, and then leaves it with the space between to then handshake further later. So I love how it's not concrete in that, hi, I just said something. It's, and you should listen. There's a partnered piece here where the other partner doesn't feel to be not necessarily present, but doesn't appear to have come into being yet. So there's a real connective piece across the time events, so to speak, as he mentioned the time events being little pieces of the divine pleroma in that last paragraph. It just feels like a piece of connective tissue, which I think is really wonderful.
And we have to understand, remember what Jung said in another video, which was the world hangs by a thin thread, and that is the psyche of man.
Right.
And we are dependent upon that holding. And in my lifetime, there have been a couple of moments. The Cuban Missile Strike, the Cuban Missile Crisis was one. The murder of JFK was another, where the future of all species on Earth was put in doubt. And we're in the midst of another one of those, which is the war in Ukraine. And we have to pray that Vladimir Putin doesn't decide that, well, okay, if, après moi le deluge, as Henry the 16th, Henry the 16th said in Paris right before he was beheaded. We have to hope that doesn't happen with Putin, because he literally does have the power to destroy all life on Earth. And
yes. And what's interesting is, even as archaic as, say, their tank force is, and how I'd say artifactual their artillery is, we start to look, if I look at China and all these, wow, they put up a 7-story, 8-story hotel in 18 hours. But yesterday I got this whole series of videos that came across where these people are, driving around this car park, and the whole car park falls. I mean, like 18 feet deep. And I'm going, wow, someone didn't drive the piles or any piles into the adjacent ground. There's no skin friction holding that thing up. They just put some concrete and stones on top of some dirt. And it's really easy and really fast to do it wrong. And but the problem is with doing it wrong is they get into the habit of just doing things, which is reactionary. And so that's where I find the trouble can lie here with Russia and with China in regards to that, is you don't have to be good to take that button and take a finger and shoot keys and guns to each other's head to, so we're not out of the clear yet, but at the same time,
well, we're clearly not out of the clear. And in terms of your example, I would just think of the collapse of that apartment building, very expensive apartment building in Miami Beach,
Right.
and the reality that concrete does disintegrate over time, and all the apartment buildings along that beach are just like that, and don't even require a bomb to bring them down. They'll just fall. And I remember.
Well, and that's also because of lack of abidance by building code structurally.
Right.
Because frankly, I remember in physics in high school, okay, one of the projects is build a bridge out of toothpicks. It spans 12 inches. How much weight can it carry? Or it spans 18 inches. How much weight can it carry? Okay, 600 toothpicks weighs what, 600 grams, maybe, and it carried 975 pounds. Well, that's because the person who made that bridge set up a module in the shape of the equilateral triangle. They didn't try to, finesse these things into holding together. They built that thing off of a template. And the thing is, the forces were continually resolved through toothpicks and glue.
Yeah.
The thing is, with the concrete, there are two kinds of concrete that's cracked and concrete that's gonna crack. That's
right.
That's
Well, I thought it was amusing last summer when I was going to our hospital every day for 2 months, and immediately after that event in Miami Beach, there were workmen in the garage of our hospital, basically being dentists on the concrete on the parking garage. And so these jackhammers going
yeah.
Okay, now Zen Mode says, could I please provide a link to this content man's relation to God? The link, Zen Mode, is the homepage of this YouTube channel and this session. So since the session isn't over, I don't have a final link for this particular video, but it is in this video, and so you can go into the video, and we're about an hour and probably 35 minutes into it when I brought that up. So you can certainly find it in the video and see all words there. It's also found in volume 2 of Letters of C.G. Jung.
Well, if I may too, just to, in short, finish up that point I was making from a structural engineering standpoint. With that toothpick bridge and then shoddy construction that doesn't mind building code. And building code is really simple. It's simply to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. Well, quality is important there. And sometimes things go beyond the building code. That's cool. But the thing about structure is it's not about materials as so much as it is about shape, which comes back to the space between of Van Cliburn, the shape of the harmonic vessel between the notes, and the shape, say, of a structural member. And like back to the toothpicks, so long as the forces continually resolve themselves in the structure, be they static or dynamic, the structure lasts. It has a service life that you can count on. But when people put things up too quickly, miss 3 pieces of rebar over here and 2 over here and 2 over here, well, you're making big breaks in how the forces are resolved through things. What happens then, concrete that's cracked and concrete that's gonna crack, well, now it's gonna crack in those spaces between that are too long. So that's the game of, because no building is static. Because if the old structural engineering joke is, well, if your deflection is 0, then it explodes because it has to go somewhere. So if it doesn't deflect to actually live the force, the building is dead, and then it comes down.
Right. So I used to work for a company that actually manufactured manufactured crack inducers, which
Right.
which is a profile of plastic that would be put down in a concrete highway every, let's say every 25 or 30 feet, maybe.
Okay.
But you see it in sidewalks where they've intentionally put these sort of furrows in sidewalks
Control
every
joint.
4 weeks. Yeah, every 4 feet. But in highways they do it a little bit larger, but they actually put this piece of plastic in between the blocks of concrete so that that would absorb the crack.
Because you generate where the cracks are going to go, and you want nothing longer than a square, or nothing that's 1.5 squares, because basically you get a span. It's going to snap in the middle. But if you put control joints, and then like every 12 feet or so, depending, you need an expansion joint where they're actually 2 different slabs. They're not even one slab. And I remember a slab being put down after someone had misplaced the rebar, and as I walked up to do the inspection, they had just knocked the rebar that they put in the wrong place down, so it was going to be on the ground, and then drilled in and set an epoxy grout, new rebar in the correct locations. And I'm like, no, you got to rip it all out. And what do you mean it's going to be hidden? I said, now you put a control joint on the bottom, it's going to crack in a V up, and we're going to get 2 cracks on the top. Because instead of doing what we do, and it's funny because it did. So it ended up, if that day they would have spent 3 more hours just rip and fill, or snip it off, would be easier. They wouldn't have had to end up replacing the whole slab. Yeah, which is 100 feet long. So,
so Diane is here, Diane Shimon, and
hey, Diane.
She says, for me, Skip, you can add to that list of threat of extinction to all the species on Earth, 9/11 and global warming, and and lots of others now, because we do have it, and we, just because the president has held back from going to war in Ukraine on a physical level yet, doesn't mean it won't happen. Okay, because there's the guns of August precedent that Hannah Arendt spoke of, I guess. And but the point is that in both cases of World War I and World War II, the United States did not enter those wars for more than 2 years. In the case of World War II, it was 27 months, from September 1st, 1939 to December 7th, 1941. And so, and I don't exactly know the number of months for World War I, but it was quite a bit. I mean, Europe was at war from August the 1st of 1914, and the U.S. didn't get into the war until 1917. So,
and will you clarify, just for everyone who doesn't understand, how that's really switching in reverse? Because World War II lasted to 1945, but so from where you're saying we got in versus the end of the war, could you just speak to that a little more to clarify? Because I think from a military's perspective, someone would get it, but from a layman's perspective, it might.
And I mean, the point is, when the U.S. finally did enter these wars, it was actually the beginning of the end for Germany in both cases. In the case of World War I, it was, the Allies and the Germans had already killed 8 million men, believe it or not, 8 million, 4 million on a side. And they just fed them to machine guns. And the U.S. came in, and the war was over then in about 15 months in the case of World War One. But in the case of World War II, it took longer because the world really was at war at that time, and there were 3 Axis powers, not one. But World War II had really started in 1933. Okay,
Right.
with the rape of Nanking by the Japanese, and so, Americans were doing things like the Flying Tigers, formed under Colonel Claire Chennault, who they actually were the Air Force of the Kuomintang, the nationalist Chinese army, which now resides in Taiwan, right? Ultimately, they lost because there are more people in communist China than in nationalist China. But at that time in the war, in the late 30s, Americans were joining up, as they did in Spain, on the Western Hemisphere, but they were joining up to fight these Axis forces even before, and we see that now with a few Americans getting into the war privately, and as a kind of foreign legion, and but they're onesies and twosies so far. But the point is that it was only when the straw finally broke the camel's back that the U.S. got into World War One, and World War II was, the attack on Pearl Harbor, and then we saw it was inevitable. And so I don't think we're out of the woods by any means now, and we can only hope that Vladimir Putin gets deposed, because short of that, something can happen that will draw us into a serious war, and not only us, but NATO entirely. So,
yeah, thanks for going a little further into that to really contextualize it and show how it is so applicable right now.
Right, and so we can't think this is a less serious event than those events in before World War One and World War II. The U.S. has always tried to keep the other parts of the world as at arm's length. We have a moat around our country, which is the Pacific Ocean, and then the Atlantic Ocean, and the Gulf of Mexico. And it's only, and we have an ally, fortunately, on our northern border, which is Canada, but they have the Arctic Ocean that they touch up against. So we have a moat really around the whole shooting match, with the exception of the Isthmus of Panama. And so Americans have always been loath to get in wars in other parts of the world. And I think,
well, and the U.S. doesn't go to war with Canada or with Mexico. I mean, it's like, it's just that was in the formation years, so to speak, of the U.S., but the Spanish-American Wars, et cetera. But now it's more of a trade thing than it is, a military thing. And it's interesting even watching.
At least so we thought. Okay.
Well, at least so we thought. And I find what's interesting, and I was surprised I didn't think about this before, but yesterday I saw a video on, the wall continuing to be built between U.S. and Mexico. and its main purpose now is to stop the migration of the deer and the wildlife. And you see wildlife dying at the wall because their migration trails are cut off. So instead of a immigration, there's a migration issue going on that I didn't. If you just cut the word immigration to migration, I mean, it's almost so simple. It's like, how we not see it? I didn't even think about that. I thought the wall was absurd in the first place, but more of an economic event, something that a economic development corporation in any municipality might put forth as capital works or capital improvements. But I was severely saddened when I saw the deer just desiccated and dying and dead.
Yeah.
And I didn't even think about how, oh, look, we put this big mar of a wall across nature. How could we have not foreseen the adverse effects on nature itself, which is not as war by any of our standards?
Right. Well, we have the issue that, what's the best way of solving our immigration issue especially along the southern border, and the best way is to help our southern neighbors in such a way that they're not motivated to leave their countries. And
Right.
if we do that, then they won't want to come. Nobody wants to leave their home in order to go live somewhere else. If you're comfortable in your home, you're going to stay in it probably until you die. But if you're not, then anything can happen, as we're seeing in Ukraine right now, where people, their livelihood and their buildings have been just obliterated, and so they don't have any choice. They have to go somewhere else.
It's true. And even if you look at the internal migration patterns within the current United States, there's a higher incidence of people moving up north and northwest out of the South from the Midwest than there was 25, 30 years ago. And you can't expect that migration pattern not to be not cultural, but just human, where it's not going to just stop because there's a border of a country. Well, the dirt keeps going south, all the way to the tip of the, like Cape. And it's interesting to me that, again, just that piece, migration and immigration, there is a relationship. And instead of the cultural us versus them, which I laugh, it reminds me of urban design problems where there's the NIMBYs and then the NUMFIs. And the NIMBYs are NIMBY and the NUMFIs are NOMFY. The NIMBYs are not in my backyard and the NUMFIs are not in my front yard, so it's all fine and good until it hits home and someone's trying to put something through, say at a, city council level. Mm-hmm. And it's like, everything's good until, but not my neighborhood,
Yeah, right. Right.
That sounds good, but not here. And so it's you have to take in ownership of basically participating in the change. And if you're going to enact the change, you can't then just retreat behind your walls and go, well, yeah, but not in my house, Right.
Well, and so we do have a few misguided fellow citizens like Donald Trump Jr., who thinks it's a good idea to stop drug production in Mexico by using missiles. Good grief. There are other ways to do it, and that's using a bludgeon to solve a problem that should be resolved in other ways.
Your friend in that spitball, that paper wad, you just reminded me of that, because Donald Trump's paper wads are not the typical American from a distance. It's the weakling who has to throw something from afar to give themselves a head start to get away. And whereas
well, I can assure you that
throwing,
my friend who did that was not a weakling.
no, but what I'm saying though is that's the Trump example of that throwing the wad. But he would throw it from outside the window, so you had to like leave the school to catch it. Your friend throws the wad, and that's you're new. We want to see what you're made of. How do you respond? How do you react? And also, hey, I kind of want to talk to you, so I'm going to get your attention. And so there's a strength move there, whereas Donald Trump is all, throwing the stuff from over the fence. It's like, get some, I hate to put it this way, but get some kahunas,
Yeah.
and so it's, and again,
well, we're going to work this aberration in our politics and our society out of the system. It's going to take a generation or two to do it, but it will ultimately happen because it's inevitable. That's what the United States represents, is that we're all descended from people who came from somewhere else, including the Native Americans. Sorry to the Native Americans, but you're not unique. You're just immigrants like the rest of us. Your family did it earlier than our families, maybe, but that's all.
Well, and I think then the quick fixes have shallow roots, is what you're saying too. And that's the last sentence in this paragraph, is this realization, God as man, is a millennial process, 1,000 years at a time.
Right.
So it's no quick fix here.
Yeah, well, there's no quick fix, but all I can say is, for all of our audience, pray for peace. Pray that Joe Biden keeps his nerve and stays eyeball to eyeball with this guy until he cracks. And I think here's my prediction of what we're going to see in the next week or two. In the next week or two, we're going to start to see the actual results of this battle that's going on in eastern Ukraine. Remember when the war first started, our news media, all the big channels were sending people into the war zone, and they were reporting results of various little skirmishes and battles. And we couldn't except for one, which was that we couldn't understand why there was a 40-mile long convoy that was stationary for weeks. And ultimately we found out that it's because the Russians either left or were killed that were in that convoy. And so, I think that right now there is a real meat grinder going on in eastern Ukraine. I don't know if the men of the steel plant in Mariupol will be saved or they'll become immortals, because what they're doing, their holdout, is basically the same thing as Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie did at the Alamo, which was that they kept Santa Anna's 5,000-man army busy for, I don't know, about 6 or 8 weeks, I think, while Sam Houston organized an army that could beat Santa Anna.
Right.
And so that strategically, what was done at the Alamo was a really extremely important thing for the development of southwestern, and south central United States and Texas.
And it's one of the origins of the cartoon that, you get the CO sitting next to the person right below him, and sir, we're surrounded. Excellent. Target rich environment. Fire at will.
But I mean, the irony is that the Alamo was surrounded by Santa Anna, and Santa Anna was surrounded by the Army of the Republic of Texas, but the Republic of Texas was surrounded by the United States.
Right.
and so if I understand the news correctly, the steel plant holdouts are tying up 12 battalions of the Russian military right now that can't crack in. And
well, it's kind of like David Bowie in music versus the Bowie knife, which came from the Alamo. That was the famous, Mr. Bowie's knife. I mean, it was in that last phase, that knife probably got a little bit of use.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt. And so, I pray that those men might be relieved and saved also. It's good that the civilians got out. I'm happy for that. And I'm happy if, but in the end, from a military perspective, I recognize that those men have to recognize that what they're doing is incredibly important for the defense of Ukraine, and they have to stay there. Either until there's a relief column, or
I would actually, I think so. I think actually they, as Ukrainians, naturally almost are born to understand that. I think it's getting that through the heads of Americans that they're support what they're doing. Don't try to, we have to go save them. We have to give them a trophy. It's like, no, it's like there's times for trophies and there's times for doing what causes trophies. And it's the process and not the process is the reward in this situation, not the production.
Right. So my prediction is that once the news ban is lifted in eastern Ukraine, what we'll see is that that Putin has lost a huge number of troops in that part of the country, and
I have to say I appreciate the news ban, because maybe somebody learned from Desert Storm and Saddam Hussein. He actually let loose, I don't know what the percentage was, but it was high, a huge number of his security and intelligence personnel, and he just bought a bunch of subscriptions to CNN. And he literally, I mean, he did.
Right.
And he got better information from CNN than he would have by paying intel people. So I think the people are like, well, we need to know. We have a right to know. It's like, it's none of your business, because what happens is surprise attacks disappear. You can't actually make a move or a breath without being noticed. And
then we
a young
got
journalist,
retired generals on CNN with maps showing exactly what's going on.
Yeah, and so it's like a bad game of Risk where everyone's cheating. I mean, if that's possible, So I mean,
but so anyway, the prophecy is that the word's going to start to get out in Russia. I saw a report yesterday that millions of Russians are downloading VPNs, virtual private networks, so that they can get the news from outside of Russia, and so that is going to start to take a toll internally on Mr. Putin, and I don't think he's going to be able to maintain his position.
Well, right, because what happens then is you're pouring one into the other, and then they have the ability to decide for themselves as to where they've been fooled and what's actually valuable.
Yeah. And I noticed that we haven't heard much from the Russian Navy lately. Since I'm a Navy guy, I honor the Ukrainians who have successfully sunk the Moskva and a couple of patrol boats. And, whereas 6 weeks ago, it looked like they were going to have an amphibious invasion and there were all these ships on the horizon, Nobody's showing ships on the horizon anymore.
Now
So.
they're nice seeds that have planted for coral reefs. Um,
Yeah.
have you seen the cartoon where the Russians are laughing out on the ships and like, this is going to be easy. They don't have a navy. And then someone goes, sir, why are all those tractors driving into the ocean?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So hello, Susan. Susan Mason is here. Good to see you, Susan. All right. I need to move on for the day. So
We're right up at time.
We will start with section 6. Section 6 next week.
Sweet.
And at this rate, we'll probably finish Answer to Job about a year from now. But if you want to go faster, I have read the entire thing just straight through without commentary online. And it is available if you need that. You can go to the homepage of this YouTube channel and find that. And also let me remind everyone that today is sort of the deadline for bed and breakfast in Helena for the Confluence. And so I will put the link on again so that everybody can look at that. It's not that you won't be able to get in after today, but if you want to have the least possible cost for your lodging, please let us know by the end of today, because tomorrow we have to cancel any bed and breakfast that we've reserved that hasn't been taken. And so we have to honor that. And so after today there will be only hotel motel lodging, and that's quite expensive at this time of year with Yellowstone open. And
I would like to say too, I understood that just reading Answer to Job straight through is on another video. I just like to put out to people, if you would spread the word a bit about this, because I think the going slow with this text specifically is important for the single reason that it really speaks to the whole of the human condition all the time in a way that I think is much more applicable directly than all the rest of Jung's work. And
right.
In that sense, I don't want to, in any way downgrade any of the rest of Jung's work, but it feels like, I feel like Answer to Job is kind of the Jung 101. You get in because you can directly relate to creation, to evolution, to your own psychological, physical, spiritual, however you are, calculus. I think it's really directly applicable to the human condition.
Right.
Is my take. I mean,
well, I agree with that. As we've talked through it, now we can see that it's quite understandable what he said here. Yeah. And obviously I think the punchline of this book comes in the last 10 paragraphs or so of the book. Right. And we're still over 100 paragraphs away from that.
Yeah.
But it's not like you can go to the end of it and read it. It's like, I don't know if you know the novel Love in the Time of Cholera by
Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Yeah. And that book, you can read the last page, you can read the last word and not have a clue what it means. You have to read, that's a novel that you have to read every poetic word, every word of the novel in order to get the last word and what it means, to grok it.
And that's the same as his 100 Years of Solitude. I mean, I remember a review I read 20 years ago. All right. It's like Gabriel Garcia Marquez is the kind of writer where someone can be taking a shit, and just in the way the experience is put in a picturesque, poetic way, it's the most beautiful thing you've ever read. And, and that's not wholly true, but at the same time, it does express that every single poetic word. I mean, there's a music in the way he put together words. So,
and this is why he won the Nobel Prize for Literature before Dylan. Dylan did it.
Yeah.
But just so everybody knows what the last word is. The last word in that novel, Love in the Time of Cholera, is forever. Okay, that's what the last word is.
Mm-hmm.
But you cannot possibly appreciate what that word means and the symbolism of that word without reading that whole novel.
Mm-hmm. But the title, honestly, is so well titled too, as to the happening. Don't lose heart.
Yep. Okay, so peace, everyone. We'll see you next week, and thank you all for being here. I'm delighted that we have a lot of regulars who've come. And Jordan, I don't know if you've looked, but some of these videos, if you go back and look at the YouTube channel, you can see how many people have hit on them. And, people on average are looking at these videos for 14 minutes now, which
that's about 6 times longer, maybe 8 times longer than the typical stat, which is honestly, and this day and age too, if someone's 14, 15 minutes, I mean, half the time, I can watch something forever, but I do notice myself going, oh my God, 7 minutes, that's too long. And
right.
So, I get it. And because not just of a false sense of urgency, but from the value of people's time and what are you going to get from that 7 minutes? And so I really appreciate that statistic that people are finding Jung's work valuable on the presentations.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so peace, everyone. We'll see you next week, and have a happy Mother's Day. Make sure you fet your mother today. We all have them. We all have them, and we all have to pay attention. Peace. Bye-bye.